Salutations, what it is. I am Marquis Nunnally. This is Midtopia Meets. I am the creative director and studio manager for Midtopia, and I am here today with our audio director, Josh Cary. What up, dog?
How are you?
I'm good, man. How you living?
Good. Great.
I believe it. You look like it.
Yeah.
But we are here today to talk about audio engineering. You've been working at this for 20 some odd years.
27.
27 years.
27 years.
So what
I don't feel old enough to say I've been doing something 27 years, but I first started recording things when I was 14.
Yeesh.
Yeah.
And what was the name of the first project? Or can you say?
No real project. It was making noise, cassette recorder, and then there was a sound blaster card in the familial PC that my brother and I slid down into our band rehearsal room, and we started recording and noodling on Sony Vegas.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't even Sony yet. Sony bought them later. It was Vegas Audio. And so that was what we were, I'm not going to say it was cracked. I'm not going to say it was. I'm not going to say it wasn't.
It was, hey.
It is what it is.
It was a thing
but that is when I started recording, and I started recording everything I could. Yeah, just trying to record me noodling around and band rehearsals and friends and whatever I could get my hands on. So,
when did you move over to do any more live sound stuff, and did that help your audio, your studio engineering?
You know, I did a little bit of live stuff. I've never loved it. It's never been my thing. I've always loved being in the comfort of a studio, making music with somebody with intention and not having to freak out if something goes wrong because I have an audience of people waiting. We can tell the artist, if you're in a studio, I can say, hey, go take 20. Give me a minute to resolve whatever this problem is, and then come back. But I did learn quite a bit of live sound stuff, as a lot of young people who grew up in Kansas grew up in a church. And there were, it seems like every youth pastor is also into music.
Sure.
And so kind of found my way into helping set up and tear down for events that we would do, and started to really learn signal flow and really understand, mic to speakers, what's all interconnected and what's happening. So I learned a lot of that just by watching others do that, and then would try and apply that when I'd go noodle around in the basement and try and make some music,
Okay.
Yeah.
So actually, that's a good segue there. What is signal flow? Because I feel like that's the first thing anyone looking to get into audio engineering needs to look into, is just where sound goes from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing.
Yeah. So signal flow I want to say it's easy. That's really unfair. I said I've been doing this 27 years, so it feels really easy to me. But signal flow is basically exactly what you said. So we start with our source. So it could be a microphone or it could be an instrument into a DI. But whatever that is, this is our source instrument. And then that's going to go into some kind of a preamp, something to give it more signal. And then the most rudimentary version of that could be right through, say, your Audient or Focusrite directly into a laptop. And you could that's your signal flow is right in through a preamp, converted through, USB or whatever. I almost said FireWire. It's been some decades since that was a thing. But, and then, then you end up in whatever your DAW of choice is. It could be BandLab Online, or it could be Pro Tools Intro or Logic, and then back out again. And so you're going to reconvert that to your speakers. And that's the most rudimentary version of signal flow. Now, in that, we also have, if you have a console like we do here in the studio, you have a few other options within that where you can activate and insert your EQ. And so you can make some changes there. You can insert a compressor in your chain, or two, depending on what you want to do, before you record. And then eventually all that's going to end up kind of in the same place, either on tape, very rarely, or in a computer, and then manipulate it and comes back out to speakers.
That seems so much easier when it's broken down like that.
Yeah.
But then you put me in the studio and it's like, figure out how to make the sound go from here to here.
Where does it start?
Right.
Yeah, the good thing is we have a really nice patch bay, and so it's very intelligent, and that if you just plug into one, and then you select one as the input on Pro Tools, and you arm it to record, you're going to get sound.
That's a thing.
So it just flows right through without having to do anything. Now, if you want to make some changes or really tweak or shape the tonal characters of the sound, you're going to have to do a few steps in between, but not always.
What are some of those in between steps?
Yeah.
What are some of those pieces that you're like, okay, you're going to need an EQ, you're going to need a compressor, you're going to need a limiter of this type. Like,
So one of the really great things is that no matter what like DAW you're in, you're going to have all sorts of plugins that come with it. And, if you're in Logic, it has an entire compressor suite, and you can select what, kind of flavor of compressor. They have I think an 1176 style, which, Universal 1176, Universal Audio 1176. They have a SSL bus style compressor. And so those things kind of exist already. But in the vein of tracking at the beginning of a project, I am one that I really want to get as much tone shaping and color imparted onto the sound as I can right away. And so I'm automatically going to insert an EQ on the console. It's an API, so it's either going to be a 550A or I think it's a 525. Don't check me on that, but it's either a three band, not quite parametric. We don't have a sweepable Q or a graphic EQ. And then I'm always going to take, bass, vocals, things like that through a distressor. We have a couple of them, and I just lean on it a lot because it's a great device that can do just a myriad of sounds. And so I'm going to, it lives in opto mode for me. It just sits at 10-1 in the opto mode on the distressor most of the time. I rarely change it. But I'm trying to impart some tonal color and control on the way in to get as much of that sound as I can. And then once you're in the box, once you're there, you have kind of unlimited ways to shape and tweak sound. Now, I will note that it's really important to understand what kind of sound you want to end up with, because if you start with something that just can't do that,
right,
no matter how many plugins you have or how many tricks you have, you're never going to get there. If you're playing a Strat through a Fender, deluxe reverb, and you're like, I really want this massive, huge guitar sound. You're not really going to get there. Probably need to grab some humbuckers and a Marshall, So starting with what you need, and that's an easy one. Guitar is a simple one to say, these are kind of the tools of the trade.
Sure.
But as a drummer, as you know, when we start with what snare sound do we want? Do we want it to be really big and punchy and have a ton of low end with a lot of snares? Do we want a 40 strand wire or a 12?
Right.
Or do we want something really tight and poppy, like a 13x5 with, like a 12 strand, almost like marching snare, really tight. Right. And so starting there and kind of knowing what you want to start with and, or knowing where you want to go really tells you what kind of tone shaping you want to start with at the beginning. And then once you're in the box, you have unlimited decisions, which can really be frustrating at times.
Yeah,
I tell a lot of my students when I teach mixing, especially, grab the basic digital EQ and the basic compressor that comes with your DAW, and mix this entire song with just those two plugins. Now, reverb, fine, but don't go crazy.
Don't do it.
But as far as all your tone shaping goes, as far as all of your controlling goes, just these two things, and really get to know the tool, because understanding what the tool does is so much more important. I have my students ask me every year, they're like, what plugins do I need to buy? And I say the same thing all the time. One, I don't sell plugins, so it's really easy for me to say, whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Use what you have is always my suggestion.
Right.
Should you go buy Soothe too? Does it help me out of a jam a lot of times? Sure. But is it necessary? No, I didn't have it for decades. Is it kind of a desert island plugin for me at this point? Yes. But learning the tools you have and learning how they work and learning what the EQ really does and what settings are important and being able to really shape something by hearing the frequency is so much more important than like chasing, do I need a Neve 1073 clone EQ? Because the answer is no, you don't. You don't have to have one. So many records were made without one that sound beautiful. So
exactly.
Start with the basics. Start with the easy stuff.
So easy stuff for someone that doesn't know, that's coming in as a freshman.
Yeah.
And you say equalizer in their face and they've got deer in the headlights face going. What is EQ for that person? Yeah.
So an EQ is frequency dependent volume, and everything in mixing, for the most part, unless it's a time-based effect like a reverb or a delay, everything's really just a volume knob. So an EQ is a volume knob dependent on frequency. So if I want less of 400 hertz, I grab that and I turn it down. And it just turns down and just shapes that part of the sound. If I want more, say like 80, because I have this nice fundamental and like a floor tom at 80 hertz and I want to boost that up, I'll take and I'll just boost that. If I want to shape the high end a little bit, I can turn that up. There's a lot of different types of EQs. The basic digital EQ you'll have in your DAW is going to be a parametric EQ. And you basically have 3 different controls per band. You have your Q, which is how wide the cut or the boost is going to be.
Right.
So you can really notch something. If you have an overtone and a snare that's just like a third up and it's constantly resonating, you can just notch that out. But if you have sort of this big boxy thing, you can go to 350 to 500 and kind of just turn all of that down. And so you can get really surgical or really wide, and that's the Q, the width of it. And then you have your frequency, which is the actual hertz that you want to turn up or turn down.
Right.
And then you have decibels, which is how much or how little you're going to boost or cut. And so you have a few other types, though, of the bands can have. It could be a high pass filter or a low pass filter, which are exactly what they sound like. If you turn on a high pass filter, the higher frequencies are going to go, and anything below your set point is going to be rolled off. It's not brick walled off. It's gently sloping depending on where you have it set.
Where you control it.
And then, same for a low pass. If you want to take some, highs that are just too aggressive out, you can go ahead and do that. Nice. And then you have like a shelf, which is you turn up or down from that entire frequency on out.
Gotcha.
And so you can say, many times I set the EQ on the board on the 550A, I set my high and low frequencies to a shelf because what I'm really trying to do, I'm not getting surgical with them. I'm trying to just give me the tone I want. And so I'm either going to, on my cymbals, I'll kind of start turning down at like 12K or I think it's 12 and a half. And I just want to sort of smooth them out so they're not so bright. And then with EQs, you have a few other types that you'll run into, graphic EQs, which the one on our console is 10 bands. The frequencies are set, and you can boost or cut.
That's
a frequency.
One. Okay.
Yeah.
So a frequency that you're able to manipulate.
That you're able to manipulate, and they're set. You can't move it, and you can't change the Q or width. That's dependent on whatever the design was that whoever designed the EQ. But you can boost or cut, in our case, by 12 dB either way. I really love those EQs for shaping guitar tones. Actually, they're just kind of set right for guitar. They sound great on them. They're not quite as flexible as a parametric EQ, but they're still really useful, especially in tone shaping. And then you have something like a Baxandall EQ, which is more like if you have a car and you have those tone knobs. That's kind of a Baxandall curve. It's really gentle. They're used a lot in mastering. They're really, really good. They're not hyper precise, and they're not supposed to be. They're for really good overall tone shaping.
Gotcha.
And there's others that I'm sure someone will comment and say, "What about these 9 other things you didn't talk about?"
Well, basics.
Yeah.
And then the other one that you mentioned, compressors. A lot of times, we just know compressor makes it loud. That's the impression. The popular impression.
Yeah.
What actually does a compressor do, and how does it do it?
Yeah, so a compressor is, again, a volume knob. And so what we have on a compressor, some compressors, like a classic LA2A, which is an opto compressor that has an opto circuit that lights up and turns things down, it's very program dependent. And so you really just have peak reduction and gain, and you don't have any other controls. But when you get into more modern compressors, you have several things. You have input and output controls, you have attack and release controls, and then you have a ratio. And then you have your final thing you have is a threshold. And not every single compressor will have all of those. It kind of depends on
which one
like the threshold on, say, an 1176, where you move into the threshold is by if you want more compression, you move the input up. And then to keep it from being too loud, you'll just roll that output back down in order to kind of match it. But what you're doing is when you set that threshold and whatever signal you're sending through it, once it passes the threshold, it tells the compressor, hey, I want you to turn down. And how much it turns down is set by the ratio. And so a 1-to-1 ratio, it won't actually turn anything down at all. It's just going to keep going. And then you get a 2-to-1 ratio, which turns it down for every 2 dB that go through, it's letting 1 out.
Okay.
For a 4-to-1, for every 4 dB that passes past the threshold, it's letting 1 out. and then 8-to-1 and 16. And, we have very set ratios on certain compressors. And then modern plug-in compressors have sweepable ratios all the way to 100-to-1, which is basically limiting, which is just, once it hits this threshold, it's getting no louder at all.
I was going to say because I've seen like on some of the plugins, they have a limiter as a part of the compressor, and some of them don't have a limiter as a part of the compressor. At what point do you say, okay, I don't need compression, I need limiting?
It depends on what the end goal is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of times, if I have, say, a really aggressive vocal, it could be rapping, or it could be just a really aggressive rock song where it's just delivered pretty quickly. Gotcha. And compression is kind of doing its thing, and I'll have maybe a medium attack and a fairly fast release, so it's kind of rubber banding and just allowing that aggression to come through. Yeah. But it's still not getting some top peaks. I may reach for a limiter and bring that down just so it never quite gets past where I want it to. And it's kind of a last level of control. Gotcha. Most of the time, I mean, there's tons of engineers, and if you just go Google, insert engineer's name here, and then vocal chain, you'll find somebody will break it down, or there's a video of them telling someone what they use. Mine is never the same. It always changes. So it's very different consistently. But you'll find a lot of modern mixers will use a limiter on the vocal just to really control, because they have a vocal that's really loud compared to the rest of the track in a lot of modern music. And in order to keep it from just jumping too much and having too much transient, instead of just trying to have a compressor do all that work for you, having a limiter really just tighten the top is a really, really good way to just slap that off and keep it clean. Most of the time, I'll find limiters at the very end of my chain. Yeah. Whether I'm just delivering a mix and I just want to bring it up for the artist so they're not having to, crank their earbuds and it's still not loud enough. Right. Or if I'm mastering something for somebody, a limiter's my final bit of dynamic control to keep it from, to get where I want loudness-wise and to keep it from clipping.
So when you start getting into more of the time-dependent plugins, time-dependent effects like delay and reverb, have you ever used those effects to do something that they were not intended to do?
Yeah, reverb on a vocal can be like a great equalizer, and not like an EQ, but like the great equalizer. I was going to say, what? I'm a big F1 fan. It's like rain is the great equalizer in a car because everybody has to deal with it. And reverb is a lot the same way with the vocal. You hear a lot of early, I've been listening to Shangri-Las a lot lately, and I just love those 60s records. Yep. And tons and tons of chamber reverbs on that. Right. And you have a few things that, yes, before tuning was a thing. Now, one, there are artists who can just flat sing.
Truth. Right.
Whitney existed, so like, she didn't need any help. But it did allow you to smear some of the sonics and sort of create a little bit of cover for artists who would maybe be a little off. And then if you stack a vocal and you have a couple of them, now it really allows you to kind of get away with a little more drift, flat and sharp on a vocal than normal. I don't find I use them for that really at all myself, because I've grown up in an era where tuning software exists. Right. I'm always asking an artist to try again if I can get them to really hit a note. But at the end of the day, if the emotion is there, then I'm going to go ahead and grab, a Melodyne or Auto-Tune or any number of, we all call it Auto-Tune. It's like calling facial tissues Kleenex. We're just sort of used to it. Right. But any kind of pitch correction plugin, I'm going to use them to preserve emotion. But, if they're 27 cents flat, I'm going to go ahead and push them a little closer to zero. Sure. Maybe not all the way. It doesn't always call for that. Right. But I want to smooth it out. But back to reverb, it's funny that you mentioned using it as a way to maybe create some cohesion. I was mastering a record a lot of years ago, probably 2011 or 12, and I just couldn't get. The record was a lot of samples, and it was an electronic record, and it just didn't have. It wasn't vibing together. It wasn't gelling. It wasn't working. And I was like, no problem. I'll slap a bus compressor on it and we'll get it working. Set a bus compressor to mimic the standard SSL, 30 milliseconds attack, auto release, a couple dB of gain reduction, and we'll be good. And I did that and was like, it sounds like the same thing with some transients, still passing, but things kind of pushed. It just, it wasn't right.
Some things.
And so I was like, what do I do? And I remember chatting with an engineer who I don't remember the name of at an event out in San Francisco a couple years prior. Mm-hmm. And they mentioned using reverb in their mastering chain. And I went and grabbed one and I slapped it on the bus instead of sending an aux, which I would never do in a mix. But in this case, I really wanted to be able to dial in the dry and wet without worrying about an aux send and a second, a second fader. And so I sat there and just moved this room reverb back and forth until I got the timing to fit with kind of the BPM, and it was kind of dying at the right time. And then I moved that wet dry mix down until you just really couldn't tell it was doing anything. But if you bypassed the plugin, it all kind of fell apart.
Oh, okay.
So it created a room cohesion that in a lot of music that we make here, where we're miking a bunch of stuff, a lot of times in the same couple of rooms, we have this tonal structure and sound of these rooms that exists on everything. And so we have this cohesion with a lot of instruments.
Interesting.
And when you take that away and you have instruments coming from all sorts of different spaces, or they're all DI'd, or whatever may be, they may be samples, like samples, or they may be samples as some people call them today, which like a sampled instrument and you're playing it back. And they don't fit well together because they're all coming from very disparate sources. So using that as a way to create a cohesion of a space, of a sonic signature, is a really cool and fun way to use reverb. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it's great.
I'm sure. That makes sense though. Because especially with modern recording, the ability to record in different spaces and have it all contribute to the record.
Yeah.
I just learned that Ricky Martin's "Livin' La Vida Loca" was the first record, the first #1 record that was recorded, mixed, edited, and mixed and mastered in the box.
Yeah, in Pro Tools. Charles Day, I think, was the engineer. I'm pretty sure. So. Someone fact check me on that later and be mad online if I get it wrong. But that's actually, I bring it up to my students a lot. And so it's a brilliant sounding record, but also it was 1999.
Right. I listened to it recently and was like, oh.
Yeah.
Okay, that's so. And then listen, I was like, okay, let me listen to this, and then listen to something that came out a year before that, just to see if I can tell the difference. And I honestly really can't unless I'm zeroing in on the fact that it's digital. And I'm like, what can be digital in this? Just trying to zero in on things.
Yeah.
But
in the case of something like that, you have an incredibly talented vocalist, some of the best producers, songwriters, musicians.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy.
Was a 10 out of 10.
Pretty easy to do something in the box.
Right.
When I was handed a mix earlier this year from a band, or handed some songs to mix, and I just kind of brought the faders and got everything leveled and went, oh, this is done. Like it just needed a few little pieces.
Some balancing.
It's not always the case, if you're working with people, especially who are recording at home. Right. But in the something with a massive international #1 hit, every single person who touched that record was an absolute legend. So it's kind of hard to get it wrong,
Truth.
But yeah.
But so you said earlier, aux and bus. You use those two terms. What did you mean by that? So when someone says you're going to send something to the aux as opposed to sending something through the bus, what is the difference there? What does that mean to the novice?
Yeah, so we use them a little more interchangeably these days because your DAW isn't quite a console. Now, if you look at, especially Pro Tools, I've been using Pro Tools for too many years, since Pro Tools 5.
Right.
And now I don't even think they have numbers anymore. It's just the year.
The newest one.
Release month, whatever. So in auxiliary, in the case of a console, is we would have auxiliary sends on each channel. And so say I had a snare and I was mixing analog and I wanted to send that to a reverb. Well, I didn't have infinite reverbs to send to. I may maybe have a few boxes, which is another thing that,
so
using just a couple of reverbs.
From your signal chain, you have your source, your
So what you're doing in an
interface
aux,
and your when you're sending the aux, you're taking that signal and sending it to, when you just said the reverb, this reverb piece of hardware.
yeah.
And you and it can only that signal chain can only go to that once. You can't send multiple signals.
So I can send if that's on aux send 1, I can send multiple things to auxiliary send 1. I could send if I have like say a Lexicon 224 hardware. There's a million plugin versions of it, but it has like a great drum room sound. And I think it's the medium wood room or something. And you could send all of your drums to it, except for, maybe not the kick, depending on how you want it to sound, or maybe the kick and then EQ it after. But you would send everything to it and then bring that back on a stereo return and mix that under the signal. And so that's how we would mix on a console, is we'd send everything out and then bring it back in.
It'd be a whole different mix of that instrument that would support the main recording.
Yep. So on your auxiliary send, you would also say, I want my snares and toms to be more in this room. So you would turn up, if it's aux send 1, you could really crank that. But if you wanted just a little bit of your, say, like overheads in it, but not a lot, you would just turn those auxiliary sends up a little bit. And so you're doing another mix of those instruments to that, and then bringing that back into a new stereo return, and then mixing that under the signal. These days, we can grab a plugin and you could just drop a reverb plugin on each channel. And I always tell my students, they're like, well, I keep running out of power. And I'm like, well, you have 17 reverb plugins in
each one.
So, and there's 9 of them on your drums, and they're all the same basically. So what you really need to do is we'll create an aux, and then we'll create a send, and then we'll send a balance of those instruments, however you want them, to that auxiliary. And now we have just that one reverb sound. And so treat it more like a console instead of putting everything there. But the auxiliaries allow us to do so much in processing that isn't just reverbs, delays. You can also send it to harmonizers and doublers, and you could send it to saturation effects to get something to sound more crisp without hitting like the whole vocal with something. Yeah. So you have a lot of options to send. And then we say bus. Buses on consoles some consoles had multiple buses, some just had your single mix bus. And so eventually everything would go to the mix bus. And that would be your final, bus.
The final output of the signal.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's your final combination of everything. If you have all of these channels, you have, a 16 channel console with a secondary fader on it, you have 32 channels, all of those go to the bus. And that becomes 32 independent things are now just a 2-channel mix. And that's your final deliverable. But these days, we have an option for creating all sorts of virtual buses. And so I'll have a bus for my drums, and then percussion, and then electric guitars, and then acoustic guitars, and then synths, and then real pianos, and
then
background vocals.
So you're just sending multiple
things,
tracks, or multiple instruments, or multiple whatever, to one channel that you can control.
And that channel
has to control all the multiple channels.
Yeah.
So that's okay.
And so I have bus processing on there, where I probably have some compression over all of my drums, or some EQ or something. I may have some vocal processing. In my case, I use a lot of the plugin track spacer from Wave Arts, and that'll go on like instrument buses, and it'll be triggered by the voice to kind of give the voice some space. And so there's a lot of bus processing that happens. And then each of those, smaller buses that have a smaller channel count, those buses will go to my final mix bus. And in my case, I have an all but drums and bass mix bus. And then I have the final mix bus where my drums and bass get added in also, and gives me some control over the tonality. And I can kind of compress everything but drums and bass without affecting the transients a little more. So it gives me some control over stuff. But those are the buses that we now have in the box. We have, it's not technically infinite, but in the in the realm of what we're actually working on, it's infinite. Like we're never really going to run out.
You never need 102 buses.
Exactly.
If you want, you can.
Yeah, they're there. Yeah, you can keep adding them. So yeah.
Woof. That's one thing that I got tripped up on a lot, was what is busing? Because in my head, I had to imagine, okay, you're busing a bunch of just like with actual busing, you're bunching a bunch of people to a space that And so in my head, I was like, okay, taking all these tracks, all these instruments, and throwing them somewhere where they can be worked with.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And you'll hear like mix bus compressor a lot.
Right. Yep.
And it's funny, like the SSL mix bus compressor, which has as many or more clones than any other piece of like studio hardware, both in the physical realm and in plug-in world. That bus compressor is probably the most cloned thing in recording history. I mean, it's incredible. But we think of it as like a mix bus compressor because it was at the end of your mix. It was inserted as the final thing. But now we think of like that bus compressor. I may have an SSL style bus compressor on my bass bus. So I'm setting a DI and an amp or, whatever to it. And so now I have that control. So you have kind of unlimited options, like I said, compared to what we used to, which is nice.
How many like analog sessions have you been a part of where you had to actually do all of that onto tape?
A ton. I did a bunch of sessions on a Tascam 4-track tape. Boom. And so you have 4 tracks, 4 inputs. But if you wanted more than that, you would say record your drums onto 1 and 2, and then record those down to 4.
Those. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And that would free those up again. And then you could put your bass on 3, and then you could couple guitars, but then sub mix all those down to 2, and then add a vocal. And quite a bit of those. And then had an 8-track tape machine for a while, but really didn't. I mean, it was at the same era as digital, and it didn't really make sense to use it much, so I got rid of it. But I had a console, Neotech Series 3, and then also a Soundcraft Ghost, a 24 channel at one point. And that Ghost was linked up with a Tascam MX2424, which was a hard disk recorder, but didn't have any editing capabilities like a DAW. And so it was very much like running tape.
I was going to say,
and then
the scissors and the tape glue out.
And then ran a lot of sessions on, Studer 2-inch tape machines, starting way back when I went to school, over 20 years ago. And then after that, there was still quite a few sessions in studios that were still reliant on tape through the kind of mid to late 2000s before it really became something that is pretty rare these days. Sure. It's just not something we do a lot.
It's inconvenient.
It's inconvenient. It can be really cool. It can be really fun. It can keep an artist from wanting to do 900 things because you only have 24 tracks, which can be handy, honestly. Yeah, but it's not. Yeah. It's been a long time since I've run a tape machine. Yeah. And honestly, I've had people ask me, "Oh, don't you wish those?" Absolutely not. I don't want to do it again. Having to get out the tweaker and put on your test tone tape and set the bias and make sure every channel was good before a session, and it's just a ton of work. And as much as I don't mind the work, I really want to do the creative stuff. And so skipping that part, for me, I'm much happier. And luckily here we have 10 channels of Burl input, which gives us a lot of that big transformer sound of a tape machine, like line input cards, that, we can get a lot of that big saturated old school sound directly into Pro Tools without having to worry about linking up a tape machine and running it as well. So
for people that want to build their studio and they're wanting, okay, I've got my, I've got a space, in my house that I want to convert into, a mixing room, what are some of the things that they're not going to know in order to plan for? What are those unknown unknowns when you're trying to make your space a space that you can mix and I guess record in?
The biggest thing, and the thing that I struggled for years with until I really spent some time with some really bright acousticians and some people who really understood studio design.
Wait, you said acoustician?
Acousticians.
Acoustician.
Yeah.
Say that when I was living slow.
When I was living in Nashville, and I got to work in some rooms and rewired some rooms and helped fix gear from rooms and spent a lot of time in some really great studios. And I got to hear what a lot of those rooms sound like and got to visually kind of look around and go, oh, so this is what they're doing. Now, what's behind that wall exactly, and what does a wall assembly look like? There are all sorts of things that are you're not going to tackle in your first build. But one of the things that so many people struggle with is room acoustics. And we struggle with it for a couple of reasons. One, buying a new microphone is sexy.
Isn't it?
Buying diffusers for your rear wall or bass traps is not that sexy.
No.
It's not the same. This is great. but no one's going to go, oh man,
I'm
look at that.
forward to
Yeah, I
getting that.
can't wait to just standing next to this acoustic panel that's going to make this vocal that much better. And it really is. It's probably the thing that makes your vocal so much better.
Absolutely.
I would much rather have a room full of these and an SM57 than a room with none of this and a vintage U47, because the U47 in a terrible room's going to be useless. So room acoustics is something that you don't have to be nearly as knowledgeable as you used to have to.
Yeah.
You don't have to understand even what a sabine is. You don't have to understand room measurements in detail.
You said
because
a sabine? I don't know what
sabine.
that is. Sabine?
Sabine.
Sabine.
S-A-B-I-N-E.
Okay.
It's a measurement of how much absorption something gives. And so everything has a level, like drywall absorbs some, reflects a bunch of the other. Mineral wool, which is what's in most of our acoustic panels around here, has a certain rating. And then how dense is it? How deep is it? How's it hung off the wall? And again, all of those things are just, you can really get into the trenches.
Surely.
But most important is to just buy enough bass trapping to get your room to where it's tolerable and make it broadband, so that now when you record something in there, you're not getting an immediate slapback off of a wall right back into your vocal, which just sounds like you're recording in a tiny boxy room. You know, most of us start in, I mean, I started recording, luckily I had parents who were incredibly supportive of me. And my father was a musician growing up, and he just thought it was really cool that I wanted to do this. So I did have my studio set up in a hallway for a while between my brother and I's rooms. It lasted for a while. My mom was finally like, this is not, like, you need to move this stuff out of the middle of the hallway. Like,
I can't walk around.
Yeah, I can't bring your laundry to you. Thank you, Mom. So it eventually went into my room. And of course, everything kind of sounded bad that I was doing. I had my little Alesis Studio Monitor 1s, which unpowered studio monitors in a room with, a bed and dresser, a very high school teenager room. Sure. And so as I graduated to really, and I don't mean from any school, but as I just learned more and I had my first space and my first home, I went, oh, I need to do something about this because I can't really do anything here. I'd bought way better speakers, better converters, better equipment. And while that was making a 5% difference, the other 90% was still completely lost.
Sure.
And I finally built some panels, hung them on the wall, bought some bass traps from GIK, who almost all of the panels in this building are from GIK. And really first started to understand, like, oh, just getting started doesn't have to be perfect. You'd see people go, oh, well, you have a 107 hertz mode, and so you need to tackle that. I'm like, well, sure, a tuned trap and all of these things.
Right.
Yeah, but really, if you can just do a chunk of it just by getting some absorption on the wall, not foam. Foam is terrible
Don't do foam.
and absolutely useless below, I want to say 400 hertz. And again, somebody's probably going to get mad about that, but it's not good. So get some fiberglass or some mineral wool. Either buy a ready-built product from somebody or grab some stuff from Home Depot and, go get some fabric and wrap it. And, it may not look pretty. Who cares? It doesn't have to be. Just knock the sound down. And so just that step, I would rather a couple $100 in some Home Depot supplies and just hang some panels around the wall to control the sound than replace my interface, because it's not going to make a difference at all, especially today. A $200 interface is better sounding than the best digital stuff that made Livin' La Vida Loca.
I believe
we've come so far in the last 25 years that it's irrelevant. So
What's been one of the biggest changes for you since you've been engineering, seeing that, because you started in the late 90s before digital fully took over. And so seeing that transition happen, how has that been from the engineer perspective? Has it been, more annoying? Has it been more advantageous? What's been more convenient and what's been less convenient about the transition in the last 20 some odd years?
Way more advantageous.
Yeah.
I mean, there's basically nothing we can't do. Right? If you have an idea and you know what you want it to sound like, and you go, hey, let's do this. Let's tackle this. if you send me what you want it to be, I can hear that and go, all right, we can do that. 25 years ago, you'd look around and go, I have an 8-track tape machine and this little console and these 2 instruments, and this is the sound you're getting because I can't do anything else. Right. And now with virtual instruments and samples being so readily available and DAWs coming just absolutely packed with emulations of vintage gear and all sorts of digital stuff and having all sorts of tools
now.
Yeah, it is so much easier to hear something even if you don't know what you're hearing yet. And I tell my students all the time, go listen to, I teach a technical ear training course, which most of the time is me just berating them to go do their homework and listen to pink noise that is boosted and trying to figure out what octave it's in, because if you can hear a frequency range, you'll be just a better engineer. But one of the other things we do in class is we listen to music and then we talk about, I always say the same thing. I turn around to them after we listen and I say, what did you hear? Well, let's talk about what you heard. And I have a few students who are like, I don't know what the drums were doing, but like you could like hear the space and, you know, you could hear this huge room and everything was just massive, but like super controlled. And I'm like, okay. So we'll like start to dissect, how do you think they did that? I never tell them because I don't want to be like, here's your answer. Right. Because one, I could be wrong. So a lot of ways to get to the same end goal.
Absolutely.
But hearing something and working backwards from it and going, okay, I have everything I need in my DAW. You could be in Band Lab and you have everything you need in there to create the sound that's in your head. And so it's just about listening and getting to work and just starting to make some tweaks and changes.
Just matching the sound in your head.
And just figure it out one bit at a time. And you will never be better than just getting in there and just working on it. And I did tell them the other day, though, that I think the most perfect record in the world that has not a sound out of place is Peter Gabriel's So. It's perfect. And out of the 10 students who were in class that day, 5 of them had skipped, so you're all in trouble. But out of the 10 that were there, I played, what did I play? It's the song that Kate Bush sings on. It's the 3rd track.
Off that album?
Yeah.
I'd have to.
Yeah, I can't remember. It's okay. I said, hey, who's heard this before? 1 of my 10 students raised their hand, right? They were all born in the last 20 years.
I was going to say, they were all no born after 2003. Yeah.
I mean, I was 3 when that record came out. So trust me when I say it's not like, I don't remember it from when it was in its heyday. But it is a perfect sounding record to me. And so I told all of them, just go listen to this record. Just go pick a song, pick a sound, and follow it all the way through. Because no sound on that record doesn't change or doesn't move or doesn't have something done to it.
Right.
And think about, what do you think they did to create that? What did they do to create that distance or that space or that immediacy with what you know and the tools you know? How would you create that? And so that's a lot of what we talk about, is just, you don't have to know like, oh, that's a boost, that's a shelf at like 12K.
Right, you don't need to know.
But you do know that like, oh, they boosted the highs. And then you can go start applying that and go, well, how did they get there? What was this? Was it just a really wide cue like Bell? Or did they shelf and turn everything up? And the difference is obvious once you hear it. So you just have to start playing with it. So
are there any hardcore rules? Like I know every engineer says no, but it helps to hear it again. I've yet to run into a sound engineer that is like, this is the rule. This is how you have to do it. And so just making sure I ask every engineer, and we're on record here. Is there anything that's a hardcore,
an absolute
line
rule
in the sand?
I have a couple of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. One is make the artist comfortable. As an engineer, you are as much a therapist as you are a technically proficient, person who, hits buttons and twists knobs.
Sure.
If an artist isn't comfortable and they've written a song and they're going to go in the booth and they're getting ready to deliver it, and they are not in a place or in the mood to do that, might as well go home. It won't matter because emotionally they're going to do it and then they're going to come back 2 days later and go, I don't like this. It's just something about it. It's, you ever hear something, you go, it's kind of flat.
Yep.
And we don't mean pitch. It just didn't work. And so making sure an artist is comfortable, making them kind of get out of their shell, doing whatever it takes to sort of get them ready to go through. And a lot of times songs, even if they don't seem personal to the person listening because they may have a vague message and a vague lyric, they may be very personal to the person who wrote it. And so they have to be in a place to be able to deliver it. Also shaking them up, making them change their space or stand on a chair or sit on a floor and just getting them out of their element. That's not necessarily a rule, but something that it's really, really good to shake up an artist if you've been working for days and just to get them out of kind of just, it's like clocking in and out. You want to just make sure they're doing the thing.
Sure.
So that's one, is just to make sure that the studio is a comfortable place and everybody feels vulnerable to screw up. And everybody go, yeah, that's not the take. All right, cool. We're good. We'll come back to it. Let's do this again. And then the second is never say no. If an artist is like, I want to do this, we may not be able to achieve it today. We may have like, hey, I have dinner. I'd like to get home to my kids. So we're not going to be here till midnight. But now that I know that, we can plan for that. Yes, we're going to do that. If you want to try this thing, even if it doesn't make the song or the record, even if it ends up failing completely, but they want to try this thing, never say no. Just always make sure and give them a place to experiment and do what they want, because you never know if that is just going to be the thing that sets the song apart and makes it really, really great in comparison to anything else.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So you heard there were no rules on the actual engineering. It was all about how the sound can get produced best in studio from
relationships
from the artist.
Yeah.
I love that. You're also a therapist. That is the truth. So thank you, Josh, for coming on and breaking down some of those concepts. I know me personally, I'm still working on, the sound engineering aspect of what I do. And so hopefully it was as helpful to everyone else as it was for me today. I hope I asked enough questions that weren't just Marquise specific. So, thanks, y'all.
Thank you.